Hello chums, and welcome to Tuning for Beginners, the series where I'll be covering every aspect of tuning and tweaking in Gran Turismo 7 to help those who are struggling. This series is aimed at road cars, since they are affected much more than race cars by changes to tuning. It's worth mentioning that my advice here will hopefully help you with consistency, but not necessarily with speed, so if you're chasing the last few tenths of a second at Sardinia to make grinding more efficient, I'm afraid this series probably won't help you. Now let's begin. In today's video, I'll be covering transmission and gear ratios, something that some cars are more sensitive to than others. I'll begin by showing you the choices for upgrades, and then I'll go into ratio adjustment, followed by my usual process from start to finish, and then I'll show a few examples that should hopefully give you an idea of what to do when tweaking your own car. While there are options for fixed ratio transmission upgrades, they are almost completely pointless, except in some rare cases where the top speed is so adversely affected that the performance point rating drops. These options will also be of the same type as a stock gearbox. What that means is, if your car has a paddle shift gearbox out of the box, these transmissions will also be paddle shift. If your car has a manual transmission as standard, these will also be manual. The two options that are actually worth buying are the fully customizable transmissions. There is a manual option, which is a cool addition that allows you to manual swap cars, such as the Lexus LFA or Mercedes SLS, which only came with automatic gearboxes. The other choice is the fully customizable racing transmission. The only difference between these two gearboxes is the speed of the gear shifts. While the manual has dead time when changing gear, where your car isn't accelerating between gears, the racing transmission shifts instantly, allowing for faster acceleration. This also helps with turbo lag on cars that are affected by it. For this video, I will just be using the racing transmission. Next, we'll go into the adjustments. There's three ways in which these gearboxes can be adjusted. Top speed is the simplest and the most compromised way to tweak the ratios. It will adjust all gears to a very generic spacing that often leaves first gear too short in more powerful cars. It's worth mentioning that top speed values are measured in kilometers per hour, so if you have no idea what a kilometer is, you'll need to develop a talent for conversions. It's also worth mentioning that if you've upgraded your car with parts that increase the red line, the top speed slider will be inaccurate, and once you go into finer adjustments, you'll see the top speed is much higher than what you set. The second way to adjust the gears is the final drive. This effectively does the same thing as top speed, but it allows for much finer tweaks. Something worth remembering is that whatever value you set the final drive to will remain if you were to go back and change the top speed. So, if you set the final drive slider all the way to the left, changed your top speed, and then went back into the finer adjustments, you wouldn't be able to move the final drive any further left. The final method is individual gear adjustments, where it tells you the ratio value as well as the theoretical top speed of that gear, in kilometers per hour. These aren't always 100% accurate though. There's some quirks here which I'll try to explain. The adjustment range for each individual gear is limited by the gears surrounding it. That basically means we can't make Gear 3 shorter than Gear 2 or longer than Gear 4. If we were to shorten second gear or widen fourth gear, it opens up the range of adjustment for third gear. The exception here is first gear, where its range is limited by whatever the top speed is set to. So, if you set the top speed low, you can't extend first gear very much. If you set the top speed high, you can adjust the first gear to over 100 miles per hour, which is very useful on high-powered cars such as the Challenger Demon. Next, I will go over my process to adjust the ratios, using this Mitsubishi Evolution 9. The first thing I do is adjust the final drive slider to the center. Next, we can change the top speed. The setting you choose here will depend on what sort of top speed your car is likely to have. If you're still unsure what to set your top speed to, my recommendation is to head to the Special Stage Route X circuit. Set the top speed higher than you think the car is capable of, and head onto the track. This should give you an idea of the car's actual top speed. As you can see, the Mitsubishi does roughly 190 miles per hour. Converting that into kilometers per hour gives us a value of 310. So now we have a rough idea of what the car's top speed is. We need to consult the power graph. You can find this by adjusting the racing ECU or power restrictor. As you can see, the Mitsubishi makes all of its power at the top end, so we ideally want the car to spend as much time in that rev range as possible. You can also find exact power and torque peaks by viewing the car in your garage. The Evo makes peak power at near enough redline and peak torque at 6,100 RPM. Since the power drops off dramatically below the torque peak, we ideally want the car to always stay above 6100 RPM. I typically go for a one-size-fits-all transmission setup, which I'll show you now. Knowing the car tops out at 310, I'll set the top speed slider to 280. Now if we go into the finer adjustments, we can reduce the top gear down to roughly 330 km per hour or roughly 200 miles per hour. This gives us some room to go faster than 310 km per hour if we get slipstream. Now we need to adjust first gear. Since this is a four-wheel drive, it's capable of an excellent launch if the ratio is set right. So head on to any track, stop the car and try a launch. The Evo launches well, but there's potentially scope to make the gear longer and still launch well. I widen first gear by 10 km per hour and try launching again. Still good. I add another 10 for 110 and try another launch. This time you can see the car bogs down slightly, so we've gone too far. I tried 105, which was still too far, so for this car, a 100 km per hour first gear is the sweet spot. Now we need to adjust the rest of the gears between 1 and 6. Generally, we want fairly wide ratios for low gears, which shorten as we go to the higher gears. By the end, the graph should show a smooth transition from low gears to high gears. Next, I test it to find any imperfections. We want the car to lose as few revs as possible with each gear change, so using bumper view helps as it gives you a better rev counter. As you can see, the revs drop quite dramatically between first and second gear, but the rest stay nicely in the power band. Back in the settings, I shorten the second gear by a few Ks and try it again. And now it's better. So, we have a transmission setup that allows for good launches, small drops between gears, and a high top speed. And, since the final drive is centered, we can adjust that to increase the overall top speed if you're doing a low drag oval race, or decrease it if you're doing a short track, all while keeping your gear ratios nicely spaced. You may want to adjust your first gear back to the launch sweet spot though. So, we now have a one-size-fits-all gearbox setup, but we could make it more optimized over a lap if, for example, you're doing a rolling start. We have the luxury of not needing to limit first gear for launches, so we can extend first gear and the subsequent gears. This closes the ratios even more, so taking the car out onto Road Atlanta, for example, we can use first gear for the slowest corners, and instead of hitting the red line, we're just entering the power band, and we're only using the top of the rev range throughout the rest of the gears. You could take this to a rather comedic extreme on a track like High Speed Ring, which has almost no low speed corners. However, we can't really extend first gear any further. The way around this is to extend the top speed slider. This will undo individual ratios, so it might be worth doing this on a spare setting sheet. This will now allow you to make first gear even longer and close up the subsequent gears even more. This trick is very useful on high-powered rear-wheel drive cars, since they'll often wheel spin to over 100 miles per hour and waste the first 2 or 3 gears spinning. I wouldn't recommend this on cars like the Mitsubishi though, because if you spin or crash, it's going to take quite a while to get back up to speed. Now that I've shown you the full process, I'll go over some examples of cars that might need a different approach. I'll start with the Alfa Romeo Giulia GTA M. This shares its advantage with cars like the Lexus LC500, where it has more gears than it actually needs. Many cars in Gran Turismo 7 have 7 or more gears, and with these cars, finely tuning your ratios doesn't give you as big an advantage as cars with less gears. With cars that have 8 gears or more, you can more or less just set the top speed so that the car can reach over 400 km an hour or 250-ish miles per hour, and it will stay in the power band. The next example will combine 2 unique issues. The Chevrolet Chevelle SS has over 900 horsepower, and as you can see from the power graph, it makes almost none of it close to the red line. So we have a huge amount of power and torque going through the rear wheels, which will lead to a mile-long burnout, and we also have a torque curve that drops off dramatically. Naturally, this car will suit changing gear manually and short shifting, but the transmission ideally needs to be altered to reflect that, starting off by setting the top speed high, We can then adjust first gear to over 150 km per hour, or nearly 100 miles per hour. While the top speed of this car is roughly 205 miles per hour, or 340 km per hour, we set the top speed of 5th gear to nearly 270 miles per hour. This is to make sure that the car is in its power band at 200 miles per hour. I will also show you a side-by-side comparison of short shifting this car versus shifting nearer the red line. There's several cars in the game that do suffer from power drop-off at high revs when fully upgraded, including the Suzuki Cappuccino, several classic muscle cars, and the 2 diesel Mazdas, so their ratios need to be set longer than in cars that make their power near the red line. The next example is the complete opposite. The Honda Beat has about 10% of the torque of the Chevrolet, and it's made at 9,000 RPM. It also only has 5 gears like the Chevrolet, meaning your ratios are going to be a compromise. If you want a gear setup that allows the car to reach a good top speed, over 140 miles per hour in this case, we'll have to compromise with first gear. We can either make first gear fairly short, meaning that we still get a decent launch, but the revs will drop below the 9,000 RPM peak in second gear. It will also mean that we can't use first gear in low speed corners, and in certain situations, second gear might drop below peak torque. Alternatively, we can make first gear longer, sacrificing our launch for the sake of less drop off in second gear, which also allows us to close up the rest of the gears slightly more as well. This also means first gear can now be used in low speed corners to allow for a better exit. A video like this would not be complete without the car most affected by transmission tuning, the Mitsubishi Evolution with the Suzuki Escudo engine swap. The Mitsubishi GTO also has the same swap. Both cars have to make do with only 5 gears, meaning that the ratio setup is compromised no matter what you do. With 1200 horsepower, both cars are capable of very high top speeds, particularly the GTO, but to attain high top speeds, you have to completely sacrifice acceleration, or launch. Redline is 8,400 RPM, peak torque is 7,000 RPM, and the car barely wakes up below 6,000, so you have one of the narrowest power bands in the entire game. Ideally, we want the car not to dip below 6,500 RPM when changing gear. For this video, I've created 2 gear sets, both of which top out at 225 miles per hour. The first prioritises a decent launch. With all-wheel drive, the longest we can have first gear is roughly 90 km per hour, or 55 miles per hour. The rest of the gears have been set up to get the car to 225 miles per hour without bogging down too much. But if you watch the footage, you will see some lag as the revs drop to around 6,000 RPM between gears. One way around this is sending more power to the rear wheels via the torque distributing center differential, which can allow you to extend first gear because you get more wheel spin. And the downside of that is that you also sacrifice the advantage of having all-wheel drive in the first place. The other gear set prioritises performance over the course of a lap at the expense of a launch. First gear is set to 120 km per hour or 75 miles per hour. This means the rest of the gears can be closer together. The launch will be terrible, but there'll be almost no turbo lag above 50 miles per hour. The other advantage of this gear set is on tracks with low speed corners. The setup is more usable on more tracks. So, I think I've covered everything I know. Hopefully my advice in this video will help you in setting up your own ratios. That was episode 2 of Tuning for Beginners. Thank you very much for watching, and if this helped you, I would be very grateful for your subscription. Take care, and ta-ra!